Everyone. I just wanted to say thank you and welcome to another AAS Town Hall webinar. Today we're going to be talking about and celebrating our LGBTQ academic surgeons and also discussing how we can improve care for LGBTQ patient population. My co-host today is Courtney Collins. Courtney's going to introduce herself. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Courtney?
Yeah, everyone. So my name is Courtney Collins. I am a assistant professor at The Ohio State University, in all caps. I'm also fairly newly married to the other Mrs. Dr. Collins at Ohio State, which I'm particularly proud of. And I'm really excited to hear from all of our panelists today because I think this is such a huge issue and something that was really not talked about when I was in training, which was not that long ago. So I'm grateful to everybody for coming tonight.
So as usual, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to send us questions. We're going to try to get to all of the questions, at least in the Q&A chat function today. We may bounce some of the questions from the Q&A to our panelists if possible and if we have time. So in order to make sure that we maximize the time today, we're just going to jump into our topics and our speakers. So I wanted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Patrick Worth. Patrick Worth is an assistant professor of surgery at Oregon Health Sciences University, where he spends his time 50% treating HPV and pancreatic disease, and the other 50% of his time is as a basic scientist looking at the immune system and recurrence of pancreatic cancer. He lives in Portland, Oregon with his husband and their 2-year-old daughter. Patrick's going to talk with us a little bit today about the state of LGBTQ representation in academic surgery.
Hi, everyone. Really delighted to be here and honored to have the opportunity to kind of talk about LGBTQ plus representation in academic surgery. And I really appreciate Khaleesi and Courtney organizing this webinar. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, is that coming through okay for everyone?
Yes.
Great. If I can, there we go. As Khaleesi mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of surgery. I graduated from my fellowship at Stanford about a year ago now in HPV, and Jelani and I actually met at Brown. She's one of us here. Where I taught a course that I inherited, but developed and grew some of the curriculum for in gender and sexuality issues in healthcare, both affecting patients and providers. And when it comes to representation for providers specifically, it really is a paucity of data. So even though it was only about 10, 13 years ago, I'm going to go into a little bit of my own background and tell you about the representation that I encountered as a medical student, and that's selecting for organizations and schools that were gay-friendly places and progressive institutions in blue and coastal parts of the country. But I think that this is an important part of the conversation for all of us, especially in identifying how we can better represent our community. And I think that this is really a rapidly changing landscape, and there's really limited data, at least in academic surgery. I'll show you a slide in a minute looking at some of the research ideas actually that I've generated from just looking at background on this. But I think that there's reason for us to be cautiously optimistic. And because we're at a critical moment in the history of our country, the history of healthcare in America, the history of what it means to be a surgeon. And so I think it's an exciting time, even with some of the Supreme Court decisions that have come down recently. I think that we're getting towards a critical mass of movements, and even some of the intersections between the advancement of women in surgery and the Me Too movement, and I look like a surgeon, and some of these other things that have arisen, and also in the representation of racial and ethnic minorities in healthcare as well, and specifically surgery. And I think it's a time for us all to kind of join as a community and try to continue some of this momentum that's been generated. And so I put here, I love this New Yorker cover, and it's been used and repurposed and reimagined in as many ways as one can think about looking like a surgeon. And I think it's a really important touch point for people who don't necessarily fit the traditional mold of a surgeon. And I'm saying that as a white male who happens to be gay. And so I think it's time for some of the those of us who belong to sexual and gender minorities to kind of help advance this cause. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the representation of our community, specifically in academic surgery. And I think it bears recapitulating the scope of academic surgery when we think about this. You know, I think that one of the broader levels of representation and kind of direction that we get is from societies and specialty boards. And so they're one source of leadership, and a big source of leadership in changing the culture on some of these issues. Academic surgery has complex referral patterns, and I think that that invests the way that some of us think about being out, being open with patients, being open with colleagues. And so specifically in academics, I think that affects the way in which we think about how we live outwardly. And then also the relationship between educators and trainees. In medical school, at least, and for the majority of residency, I had very few, if any, openly gay mentors, or even not even mentors, but surgeons that I could point to wanting to get into academic surgery as a model of success as a young surgeon, to say, yeah, I can live openly and proudly and still be successful in this field. And I think that one of the other components that we have to consider in academic surgery is career mentorship and P&T promotion considerations in what becomes a very, very small, ultimately small field for many of us. So I wanted to delve into the literature, and as I started to look for some data to drive this conversation, I just started looking at mesh terms, because some of the things that I was typing into PubMed started getting ridiculous really quickly. And when you're looking at, there's a mesh subheading for surgeons, and the mesh subheading that covers the majority of LGBTQ plus issues is sexual behavior, or also homosexuality, homosexual male, homosexual female. So these terms are fraught in and of themselves. But in searching some of the larger hit terms for correlation between these things, surgery is pretty underrepresented in the literature, and I think that's something that we can, as academic surgeons, participate in and work on. I went through all of these studies for surgeons, and really none of them focus specifically on the idea of a surgeon as an out individual or person. And for a number of these, for physicians generally, the data is quite poor. So then I spent the last few nights actually going through, and now I'm developing this into a project, looking at what specific societies and groups kind of on a national or regional or specialty level say, at least in their public-facing role, about LGBTQ plus individuals. And by the way, the the intersectionality between people of color, between women, and basically between any underrepresented minority in surgery tends to hold up, save for a few exceptions, across these distinctions. So I think that this is also something that we can do as members of some of these societies to improve this representation. So only 46% of the 20 societies, and you can see them listed below. I hope that's not too small for everyone, that I was able to look through, actually mention in their bylaws or constitution or some kind of foundational document that sex or gender minorities, people of color, or any kind of non-discrimination language in their bylaws. And I think that's really low-hanging fruit and would be easy to change in some of these societies. Representation or a mention on the main page, to its credit, only showed up in the Association for Academic Surgery with this town hall and with a link to this town hall. But generally, there is, even for other underrepresented groups, very little in the way of representation on the forward-facing part of these pages. Advocacy or representation of these groups in deeper searches of website text was only about 15%. Some type of subgroup or committee on diversity and inclusion, just as a very broad topic, only existed in about a quarter of groups. And then only about 15% had any kind of programming at all at annual conferences. And I went through a number of programs to look for any kind of potential representation. Almost 54% of groups had no mention at all of any representation for LGBTQ plus persons, sex, gender identity minorities, or underrepresented minorities in medicine. So I think that this is a real opportunity. So I've decided to expand this and start looking at surgical residency pages. I didn't have time to do that, but I think that that's also would be a really interesting place to look for how these topics are discussed. And I think residency programs probably do a better job, just anecdotally, of raising these issues, but I think it's still a major issue. And why does it matter? There is one, and forgive me if this has been published, but this was an abstract that was presented at the ASC in February of this year. So if anybody has, I couldn't find a publication on this abstract yet, but it's really interesting data, and it comes from the 2019 ABSITE, which is the in-service training exam for any non-surgeons who are watching, that residents take every year. And there's typically a survey question at the end of this exam. 86% of residents responded, and there was about 6,000 residents represented. And of those, 314 identified as part of the LGBTQ plus community, about 5%. And the reason that this becomes important is because you can see in these odds ratios below here that for LGBTQ males, LGBTQ females, and it's again subdivided by these genders, so that's difficult. But for the purpose of the presentation of the data, they're at much higher rates of experiencing discrimination, sexual harassment, and bullying during their training. And we know that that any experience of these leads to a threefold higher risk of suicidal ideation in a lot of wellness data that's presented for surgical trainees specifically. So I think this is a call for all of us to expand the areas in which we are advocating for our community. I think the representation of LGBTQ plus persons in medicine, but specifically in surgery and in academic surgery, is really poor. And for the reasoning for which we've got to spend more time on this is that it affects all underrepresented minorities in surgery and academic surgery. And I think it's super important for, especially a white male who identifies as gay like me to be out and open to colleagues that I can typically pass until I tell them about my husband or my children or who I am. And so I share that with people, and I think it's a really important part of my personal practice to be out with trainees, to be out with nurses and colleagues, because it changes the conversation and changes what the majority think, accept, consider to be what a surgeon looks like. So I've rambled on. We've got 3 other great speakers, so I'll stop sharing my screen, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That's super, super interesting. I will say, in terms of societies, I think it's a really great point. And actually, there's a very newly formed society for LGBTQ plus surgeons. Nova, I know, is a member. I don't know if you are as well. It's the Association for Out Surgeons and Allies, for anybody who is interested, AOSA. They're on all of the social media platforms. So please check them out. So I've always wondered this, as a LGBT person, I always feel like I'm the only gay surgeon in any room that I'm in. And I don't actually know if that's true. Do you think there's a representation problem, or do you think there's a visibility problem, or both, or, where do we sort of sit there? And then do you think it's really changing at an appropriate rate, or because I do sense that it has changed over the past few years. Do you think we're making the appropriate strides? Do you think we could do better?
Yeah, so just to unpack a couple things there. I did have as my last slide a screenshot of AOSA from Facebook. So I would encourage everyone to join that. I also wanted to give a plug for Oriel August, who is a Stanford surgery resident that I worked with closely, but she is a phenomenal writer, a queer Black surgeon from Stanford, and she is just great to read and really wonderful. I think that the rate at which things are changing just anecdotally seems to be encouraging. It's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to know what is. I mean, and I think it's very easy for me to say, be out, because I have the benefit of being a white male, and that I think makes it easy for me to say that. I frequently feel like I'm the only gay surgeon in a room, and I try to be as open as I can about that, just so that culture and that conversation can happen and can change.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Patrick. We're going to introduce our next speaker. Giolani D. is an assistant professor at the Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, Oregon. She is a urologist by training and has a special clinical and research interest in gender-affirming surgery and reconstructive urology. She's also very focused on patient-centered outcomes after gender-affirming surgery, and she's going to talk with us a little bit today about her work.
All right. Thanks, Callie, for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here and speaking with you all today. I'll switch to my screen share now. All right, so can everyone see that okay? All right, so I'll be focusing on discussion of caring for the trans and non-binary community within academic surgery as a way of, being a surgeon who's working towards eliminating LGBTQ health disparities for the greater whole. And just to sort of go into my history of how I got into this is one of the areas that Callie and I were talking about as I was getting involved in the town hall. There have been sort of touchstones over time, and sort of the culture of academic surgery and its intersection with trans health has really changed over the course of my training. I grew up in the Bay Area and was very involved in sort of marching for same-sex marriage legalization, and then went to a liberal undergrad college where I studied medical anthropology and was awoken to ideas of structural violence throughout my education. And then as a Brown Med student, took the course that Patrick led on LGBTQ plus health disparities. And that was actually my first sort of exposure and interaction with the trans community as far as specific health disparities were concerned. And then, having a lecture from one of our pediatric urologists on differences of sexual development or the intersex community was very meaningful in sort of shaping the direction of my career and my desire to go into urology specifically, in pediatric urology actually. And then over the course of my residency in Seattle, initially the idea of pursuing peds urology as a way of taking care of the DSD population was my goal, but amid ACA's Section 1557, there is increasing sort of coverage of gender-affirming care. There's growing media spotlight and political discourse on the trans non-binary community. And it became clear to me that there wasn't really we weren't serving that population within academic surgery and urology to the extent that I thought we should. So I started sort of exploring on my own because there weren't really training programs within the US, and it looked like I would have to go abroad for specialized training in gender-affirming care. But by the time I finished residency, I was able to enroll in NYU's fellowship, which is the first US urology fellowship that sort of focused on gender-affirming surgery. And now progressively there are more. And I've since joined OHSU and our multidisciplinary sort of comprehensive transgender health program, where I'm exclusively focused on providing genital gender affirming surgery for folks on the gender spectrum. And in these years, we've seen major growth in gender affirming surgery programs at academic centers around the country. All right. So if I had to distill how we can advance the care of the TGNB or transgender non-binary community through academic surgery into sort of 4 main action categories, I would say the first would be to educate yourself and trainees. The second, to sort of put that education into action and to provide trans competent care. And then if you want to sort of delve specifically into trans care health disparities and outcomes through research and study in clinical care, you can do so. And then partnering with the community as you embark on that journey to transform clinical care and research at your institution. So the first piece here about educating yourself and trainees. There are a number of studies out there that show that the amount of exposure we have to LGBTQ plus specific healthcare needs and specifically trans healthcare needs is very low. And a few colleagues and I did a study several years ago surveying program directors around the country in urology and plastic surgery. And we got a pretty good response rate, over 70%. So, the data is fairly representative here. And we saw that in urology, there was a significant proportion of programs that had zero exposure at all to transgender health topics. And it was slightly better in plastic surgery with a median of 2 hours. But in these 2 subspecialties where, we're dealing with complications of genital gender affirming surgery and having, unique needs brought up amongst the trans community, we were clearly not, we're not stepping up to the plate from an educational standpoint. When we looked at regional differences in urology and plastic surgery program directors' attitudes. We found that there are differences based on geographic region. So in West Coast urology and plastic surgery programs, a far greater proportion of program directors felt that some degree of trans-specific education was relevant and important to provide in their residencies, whereas in the South, the proportion who thought that this was important work was much smaller. And we saw that these, or there was a correlation between program director attitudes and the actual amount of education that was provided in programs. And so this was just so indicative of how, potentially individual biases, sort of regional culture can impact the education that trainees are getting, and that thereby impacts trainees' comfort with caring for trans and non-binary populations, their ability to sort of competently meet patient needs, and to be open to caring for these populations. And so, just assuming that the vast majority of our listeners did not get any dedicated education in trans care in the same way I didn't, here are some resources that you can use just starting out. Here's a JAMA surgery review written by Dr. Burley, one of my colleagues here, and a host of other leaders in gender affirming care about what surgeons need to know about gender confirmation surgery when we're providing care for trans individuals. And then Transgender Law Center has a really nice pamphlet on 10 tips for improving services for trans people. And then also WPATH, or the World Professional Association for Trans Health, is sort of the meeting of multidisciplinary folks or providers who are passionate about the care of trans people. And so there are conferences every year, as well as a lot of local events. So point 2 was, providing competent care. And there are so many ways in which you can do this. But if I had to distill it to, where the surgeon is interacting with patients and sort of the sphere of the individual surgeon, I would think about intake processes and, the facilities that you have control over. Looking around your clinic setting and seeing whether there are gender neutral bathroom options, whether your clinic intake forms only list male and female, whether there's sort of confusion between sex and gender on these forms, and really sort of taking a critical look at that and seeing if there's anything that you can do to advocate for change to make it a more inclusive environment. When you're meeting a patient who's on the gender spectrum for the first time, getting comfortable with asking your patient what pronouns they prefer, and then honoring that and using those pronouns, making sure that you use their chosen name. And this can be a problem in EMRs, really, that patients are registered under a name that they really don't identify with, and it can be really sort of hurtful and damaging to your provider-patient relationship if you aren't using the right pronouns and aren't using the right name. And then carrying that into your clinical documentation. So sort of, again, recognizing that Epic templates are going to auto-populate what the legal name might be, but going through and being mindful of your patient's pronouns and gender identity, as well as their name, and changing that where you can, and making sure that the patient feels included, as, especially with meaningful care. A lot of patients are now able to sort of see and read notes as we write them, and so this is especially critical, I think. And then, acknowledging that folks who are assigned male at birth, who identify as trans women, are trans female, and so sort of eliminating some of that confusion and looking it up if you don't know whether or not you're supposed to say trans male or trans female, since I see this in a lot of provider notes. And then also focusing on clinical care rather than curiosity. And this is an area where there are many reports of trans-identifying patients feeling like their providers are asking them sort of inappropriate questions related to their genitalia or their transitions. And of course, like, that's my field, but for a lot of people, it's not. And, how you care for someone in terms of, upper GI surgery may have nothing to do with their genitalia. And then finally, this idea of bystander intervention. You can be in an environment like I am at OHSU, where we've taken great strides in sort of making an inclusive environment with bathroom signage and sort of access for gender diverse people. But if someone is being misgendered by a staff member or someone else on campus, and no one says anything about that, that can do a lot to make a patient feel alienated. And so speaking up when you hear something that's not right. And so my next point here is studying trans and non-binary health disparities and outcomes. So while my field is, specifically genital gender affirming surgery, and so this is all I do, there are a lot of areas across other fields, other surgical specialties, where there are unique intersections between your work and sort of unique considerations in the trans population. So if you encounter trans identifying patients and you sort of see recurrent themes, or you see areas where the care you're providing may need to be sort of thought about in a special way or adapted for the trans population, then that's an opportunity for you to investigate this area and sort of call out a need for more literature as well. So these are some papers on cervical cancer screening in trans male patients, kidney transplant considerations, which have to do with anatomy, EGFR estimation, which is often sex-based, and then stem cell donor transplant, and then injury in the trans population having to do with anatomy. And then finally, partnering with the community, if you are embarking on this journey of sort of trying to transform clinical care within your own institution and clinic and research. So I focus on patient-centered outcomes research, so working with trans community members and patients, caregivers, and sort of multi-stakeholder teams to define community priorities in research and to partner with patients every step of the way in developing research ideas and implementing research that's meaningful to patients, and then disseminating it appropriately to the trans community. And this takes place through early steps with community engagement and advisory boards and planning phases, but also throughout the research process. And certainly applicable if you do want to make changes in your clinical environment as well, sort of finding a local champion who you can partner with to make sure that you're seeing things not from the cis person's perspective. And then the aspect of ensuring diverse stakeholder engagement and acknowledging intersectionality. So really thinking about the way race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation all sort of come together, and the ways in which we need to really promote representation on all these levels. And then here's a little open letter from the patient community to the WPATH with this "nothing about us without us," which really I try to keep in mind as I formulate research questions and projects, really just partnering with the community. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think this is such an important issue and something we don't talk a lot about and don't get a lot of exposure to, honestly. So I really appreciate your thoughts on this. Can you sort of alluded to this before, but can you just, for those of us, I don't see a lot of trans or non-binary patients in my practice. And I think for all of us, it's sort of figuring out how to approach them in your office to make them feel safe, kind of talking about that sort of thing. Cause I think there is a lot of fear about, big medical institutions and honestly surgeons in particular, I think, that make patients very nervous to sort of share that. Like, do you feel like, for example, I need to know someone's gender just to know if they need a pregnancy test before surgery. That's kind of the extent, but I do need to know, is it something I should wait for them to bring up? Should I ask, just be very direct about it? How do I really make them feel safe when they're kind of in my clinic and that, I'm not going to get into their business too much?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, going back to just asking a person their pronouns, which pronouns do you prefer, sort of signals that you are interested in understanding their gender identity and respecting that. And so I think that that sort of opens doors. And then also focusing specifically on organ systems, do you have a uterus? And we need to know in preparation for, your pre-op testing. So focusing on, making an inclusive environment in your clinic room through pronouns, and then organ-specific questions.
Just out of curiosity, do you ask everybody their pronoun? Like if I walked into your office, would you ask me too? Is that just something we should do for everybody to make it less weird for us, or?
That's a good question. I mean, on my intake forms, because I do see some cisgender patients as well. I have pronouns listed, so it's just always written out, and so that is an option. But yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about that from the perspective of someone who does not see a majority trans population. I think that it could be a practice that you start.
Gio, I know you have to go, so I'm going to ask this question from the audience. Do you have specific suggestions for how to make the mammography experience or other traditionally gendered clinics more inclusive? For example, cervical screening, cervical cancer screening, mammographies, et cetera, for trans male patients.
So that's a really good point. I think the problem is that a lot of these clinical settings are very gendered. They're women's health clinics, and when we started doing orchiectomy, where I was in residency, it was patients were having to show up to the men's health center to talk about, this first aspect of feminizing genital surgery. And so really trying to, if there's anything you can do to sort of take the gendered aspect out of the signage, or sort of their, the paperwork folks are filling out, I think that's an important first step. And then just making sure that all the staff are aware of how to be respectful of folks with trans identities, especially, mammography sort of techs and whatnot. Those would be two sort of easy and important steps.
All right, thanks so much. I wanted to address two quick things. One, my failing in that one of the topics that I really wanted to cover during this town hall was intersectionality, and specifically someone talk about Black trans lives. And I wasn't able to secure a speaker. So I know that there is a gap in today's conversation about that. I promise you we're gonna try to circle back around and cover this throughout the year. But additionally, a couple comments that came that were verbalized in the Q&A is feeling or experiencing marginalization and exclusion during junior training period that basically discouraged several people on this webinar from coming out during their training. And then also stating that support from high-level leaders and society presidents is needed to make people feel safe about coming out, especially during training, to avoid discrimination. I can tell you that we are really actively trying to, one, speak out about this, and two, address this within our organization here at the AAS. And so please feel free to send me a private message on Twitter if you're interested in working on some of the initiatives that we'll have coming up. And then I would be remiss, I know nobody's gonna speak later on in the program, but the Association of Out Surgeons and Allies, I think, is a powerful organization that we hope to really build a very solid partnership with that should grow over time. And I think Nova will talk a little bit more, hopefully, about that later on today. The Twitter handle, since that's come up a couple times, is @OutSurgeons, @OutSurgeons. All right, thanks. So introducing our next speaker, Dr. Harvish Mogul is an assistant professor in the Division of Surgical Oncology at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and he's the leader of the HIPEC and Regional Therapies program here. He has an active interest in issues of diversity and inclusion, including LGBTQ representation in academic surgery. He's going to talk to us about allyship.
Thanks, Calicia, and thank you, Courtney. This is an incredible opportunity. My talk on allyship is going to focus on some of the more easy ways to kind of be an ally. I'm very lucky to belong to a division specifically, and a department specifically, though, a division where we have a bunch of LGBTQ faculty that are out and open. So we have safe spaces that we can talk to people in and feel nurtured and welcome in. But I know that's not the case with other people. And I wanted to focus on this topic because just based on what Patrick, for example, showed earlier, there are so few people who identify as openly LGBTQ within the surgical community, especially in academic surgery, that it's very important for non-LGBTQ identifying folks to truly be allies. So I'm gonna quickly share my screen here, and I hope everybody can see it. There we go. So one of the biggest ways you can be an ally is by creating more inclusive spaces. And you want to create an inclusive space by making sure that every conversation you have, every team that you're involved in, every relationship in the workplace, you make sure that LGBTQ folks feel welcome, that they don't feel shut out, that they don't feel awkward, and they don't put up walls in front of you. So there are a few simple steps that you can take as allies. You know, putting up a pride flag on your desk, or going to a pride parade, or following LGBTQ folks on Twitter. Those are great things, and we want you to keep doing that. But there are other things that we need to do. And so at the end of this talk or webinar, if there's one thing I can do is to challenge you on this, and, you know, ask you to be intentional about doing at least one of these things moving forward, so that you truly become an ally that you value and that you aspire to be. So one of the things you can do is start by being affirming. And that simply means sometimes just listening. So when your LGBTQ faculty or resident or medical student comes and talks to you, whether it's venting about certain issues or just confiding you about their struggles, or even just talking about their experiences in life, don't shut them out. Just listen. Don't try to offer any sort of opinions. Don't try to dissect their situation further. And certainly, obviously, you know, it goes without saying, don't judge them. Because what will happen with that is that, like I said earlier, they'll put up a wall, and you will never be able to truly make them feel safe. And I think we owe this to LGBTQ faculty. Affirming their identity in the workplace is important, because we do that with cisgender faculty all the time. And I think this is a very, very key and important component of changing the culture in a work environment. All of us can do that work if we work as individuals and intentionally work towards making sure that this happens. Stand up for us. You know, I cannot tell you how powerful and how important it is as a straight cisgendered colleague for you to stand up when you hear or see something that's just not right. You know, we had an excellent grand rounds today by one of our D&I officers at MCW on microaggressions. They happen very often, but I'll tell you, there are macroaggressions that happen very often too. And we're so focused on our lives, you know, in the operating room, for example, someone makes a comment or says, brings up a joke flippantly about LGBTQ folks, fairly derisive. You know, speak up. You know, there's a good way to tell people that, you know, I don't think that's cool. I don't think that's really acceptable. It's an opportunity to teach, and it's an opportunity to make sure that your influence is exercised. And you will realize how powerful it is in making sure that this doesn't happen in the future. Because one of the key components of making sure we're safe is to speak up for us. And I'd love to have in every department or division an LGBTQ faculty that'll actually keep people accountable and in check, but you know that's not going to happen. So we really rely on you as our esteemed allies to do this for us, because this is important work. And I think this also, as you know, this also sort of goes to the whole point of intersectionality. You know, there's components of minority-related workplace culture, etc., that fairly intersect with what I'm talking about in terms of LGBTQ allyship. And I think keeping that in mind is important, because when you stand up for one thing, you can stand up for other things too. Be empathetic and be accountable. So it's as simple as when you don't know how to react to a situation, initially listen. If you've made a mistake, don't be defensive. don't focus on the technical terms. I can tell you, when I started out this process, there were a lot of nuances that I wasn't aware of, and I made mistakes. I made mistakes with transgender individuals. I apologized, and then I went up and read. Because don't expect them to explain to you the meaning of certain terms all the time. Understand where they're coming from. They've had to put so much faith and courage just in coming out and being who they are. The least we can expect from our allies is to be empathetic and hold themselves accountable. So apologize. Go and do your own reading. There's plenty of resources out there that'll educate you on these things, and you'll get better with it, with it in time. Remember, people are not as fixated about the technical issues or about even the mistakes that you make as much as they are about the emotions that come forth and the genuine feeling of care. And I think that's important. I think this one, in terms of recognizing the toll on minority tax, is really important. And I think it again goes to the area of intersectionality. So minority tax is typically defined as the tax of extra responsibilities that we place on minority faculty in the name of efforts to create diversity and inclusion. And there are different facets of this minority tax that specifically affect LGBTQ folks. So the isolation tax, a lot of the panelists here mentioned that just as part of being LGBTQ and different and not seeing a whole lot of role models around us, we tend to feel isolated. And oftentimes what happens in the workplace is very different from the policy set forth by institutions. And part of it is because there is no inclusion of those LGBTQ faculty at the highest levels of leadership. So what you have to understand is that this is a hard situation for them to be in. And if you are not a strong ally in the workplace and make sure that they have adequate representation, that isolation only worsens. And this also connects with the mentorship disparity. It's almost impossible for every single LGBTQ resident or medical student or even junior faculty to find an LGBTQ mentor. And I would encourage you as allies to seek them out, because giving them that cisgender perspective actually helps. It helps balance some of the perspectives they have. So actively seek out your mentees when it comes to common goals in terms of career building or your research or your clinical interests, because it's really important we do that. Otherwise, there's going to be a significant dearth of mentorship for LGBTQ young faculty or residents or medical students. And the last one that's also not recognized very often is the gratuity tax. And by this, I mean, oftentimes being part of the minority population within academic surgery, we're expected to be grateful for the work we, for the opportunities we have, or the roles we are provided. I can tell you from conversations with other people that this has come up more than once in their lives when they've had opportunities to go elsewhere to build their careers, that they've been reminded of that. And don't place that burden, please, on LGBTQ faculty, because it is not something that they should not feel that burden of that tax to stick around in a certain place or do certain things that are expected of them as a part of being grateful, so that they don't advance their careers. And I think I would, again, ask you to be intentional about recognizing these issues around you in your workplace and working actively to change it, even at the highest levels of leadership. And then one of the things that every one of us can do, including LGBTQ folks, as well as our allies, is to reach out to the community. As Giolani had alluded to in her talk, make sure that there are intentional efforts from within your organization to actually reach out to the community, because having your own institution as a silo is not going to help. You need to reach out into the community to let people know that there are allies within the institution. It'll not only help LGBTQ folks within your institution gain more visibility, but also will bring patients in the door. For example, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with my patients, and I didn't, for example, I didn't see a partner of one of my patients once in the clinic, and I asked about whether they had their significant other, and then they identified themselves as lesbian. And they told me they were extremely uncomfortable bringing them because they were concerned that they would be judged. So I immediately realized this was an opportunity for folks within our institution to do something about it, to make sure that people have, for example, that we market ourselves, as an LGBTQ patient-friendly environment, that we have support out there in terms of philanthropy support. It doesn't have to be dollars, it can be in kind. For example, I volunteer, and I have several non-LGBTQ ally friends who volunteer at one of our long-standing STD clinics within Milwaukee. And then make sure that you ensure that there is representation of the community LGBTQ members at the highest levels. Again, whether it comes to advisory boards or panels within your institution, make sure they are actually actively involved, because they will bring up so many issues of advocacy that you will have not thought about that will make your place more inclusive. So at the end of the day, I'm going to leave you with this thought. I think whatever you do, being an ally, the symbolic issue, the symbolic things matter, obviously, and we want you to keep doing them. But please be really intentional about these things. It's very easy for us as busy surgeons to get caught up in our lives. We have deadlines to meet. We have stressful patients in the OR. Someone had a complication. We've had so many things going on with our lives all the time. But be intentional about recognizing these things. And I would challenge you to take away from this webinar one of these points that you will actively seek to incorporate within your workplace culture to make it more inclusive for LGBTQ folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have to say, everything that you said, honestly, really, really resonated with me. So when I started training, I was the only gay resident at my program, the only openly gay resident at my program. Turns out there were more, but anyway. But that was back in the day where you called, when something was stupid or bad, you called it gay, right? That's what everyone did. And it happened all the time. And I would say something when I had the energy, but even just having one other resident say hey, that's not cool, would have been just hugely helpful. So, I just really that just really, really resonated with me. So thank you. There's a question on the chat that I'm actually thrilled to see. Someone wants to know, so do you have any specific advice for people in leadership positions, chairs of surgery, section chiefs, to make things easier for their faculty there and also for their residents? You did a great job, I think, with the kind of day-to-day stuff, but what organizational steps can people take for the people in leadership positions?
Thanks for that question. So I think it boils down to, again, being very intentional. I think at the level of leadership, faculty need to be aware that these, at the end of the day, while everybody is struggling with issues around them, securing grant funding, managing their, research and clinical lives, dealing with complicated, stressful situations at work, we have that added layer of being out and open as LGBTQ faculty. Specifically taking that into account, it would be very important for, say, a department chair to work actively with faculty to make sure that they don't just get mentored by someone who is like them, but they are actively getting mentored by people who see commonly with them in terms of their research goals, for example. And the reason that's important is that because as LGBTQ faculty, whether you're out or you're not out, there can be so many things that hold you back in terms of your ability to approach other people. But when you have people at the highest leadership levels telling you that this is a safe space and that they are free to explore what they want to do in terms of their academic and clinical productivity, I think it sends a message throughout the entire institution, or at least the department.
I'll also add, I think that these topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion are really becoming much more commonplace. I think these conversations are becoming more necessary. And I think that we are demanding more direct discussion about this. And so I think that one of the things that we need to do is really have continued discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to all minorities. And I think that there has been a significant lag that may be generational, but I think the time is now for us to be bold and to really demand of our leaders that this be the norm. It should be the norm that you should be allowed to walk into a room and be yourself. It shouldn't be any other way. And I think right now is the time to sort of really reach out, find allies amongst you that really believe in this mission, and try to change your culture, if possible, at your institutions to be inclusive of everyone. And I think that as we all sort of unite and focus our efforts, I think things will actually improve. I think these conversations are happening at higher levels much more frequently than they definitely were 5 years ago. And I would even argue 5 months ago. So we have the climate currently has really afforded us the opportunity to be bold and ask more of our leaders. And so if you need advice, if you're looking for people, there are a ton of people within the AAS that are hoping or willing to partner with you. If you have an idea, please let us know. Okay, so we're gonna introduce our final speaker. Nova Zoka is the assistant, an assistant professor in bariatric surgery at West Virginia University Department of Surgery. Her clinical practice consists of bariatrics and foregut. Sorry, I lost my introduction here. And her research interests include surgical innovation, outcomes in bariatric surgery, and healthcare disparities in sexual and gender minority populations. Nova is going to talk with us a little bit today about how to navigate your career and how out to be.
A challenging topic. Thank you, Doctors Clark and Collins and the AAS and all the other speakers. It's really great to participate in this conversation. Here are my disclosures. And really, before I can answer that question, we need to consider a few elements about, how to be out in academic surgery. Well, number one, what is the state of anti-discrimination law in the workplace for sexual and gender minorities? So I've been switching over to the term sexual and gender minority because it has one less letter or two less letters than LGBTQ. So SGM. And so what we see around legislation is that 20 states have good legislation in place to prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 26 states have nothing in place. And then 3 states with the exclamation points down there actually have laws in place to prevent enforcing or passing non-discrimination laws. So I think this is something for anyone who wants to be out to know, am I protected on a statewide level? The second question, which Dr. Worth has already alluded to, is what is the state of our minority or sexual gender minority residents in training? And so I want to show 2 studies, one from before gay marriage being approved and one from after, to see if we've really seen any changes in attitudes or behaviors. So this is a really nice study from 2014. It was a national survey of general surgery residents. They captured about 388 and found 43 disclosed residents, which was actually 11%. And they saw that 1/3 of the residents didn't reveal their sexual orientation when applying for general surgery residency. Furthermore, those residents felt uncomfortable discussing their spouse or partner with their fellow residents and their attendings compared to heterosexual residents. And they felt uncomfortable bringing their spouse or partner to surgery department events. Among everyone in this survey, half of them witnessed homophobic remarks made by nurses and residents, and 30% of them witnessed homophobic remarks by attending physicians. And so when asked, hey, are you out to your fellow residents and attendings, we saw in 2014, 57% were not out to their residents, and 52% not out to their attendings due to fear of rejection, poor evaluations, and many experienced targeted homophobic remarks. So fast forward to June of 2015, that's when gay marriage or same-sex marriage was legalized in the US, and the past 5 years. And so I'll show a summary of the same study Dr. Worth has already discussed. So this is from 2020, a group at Northwestern, looking again at the experiences of sexual minority residents. And I wish we could say that between 2014 and now, things have improved, but I don't think they have. And so this survey was administered after the 2019 ABSITE. Again, the respondents got a battery of a test looking at sexual harassment, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and then again, bullying. And the numbers, this hasn't been published as a paper yet as far as I know, but they got 8,000 responses. Of those, 6,900 residents were clinically active and included. And of those, 6,500 residents disclosed their sexual orientation and gender demographics. And of that, that identified 4.5% LGBT. Now, if we look at national surveys, the 2016 Gallup survey, the number of LGBT adults in the US is identified somewhere around 4%. So what I would say with this most recent survey, identifying about 4.5% LGBT residents, we have diversity, right? We're capturing the number of about the prevalence of LGBT nationwide in our programs. What we don't have is inclusion. So what we saw is that, these residents are experiencing more sexual harassment. When you look at the breakout of the sexual harassment, women also experience more harassment than men, and then the LGBT females experience the most. And so there's a degree of intersectionality there between sexual orientation and just male-female. Similarly, the residents experience more discrimination, with an increase in the female LGBT residents experience and bullying. What's disheartening is that attendings were the most common source of this discrimination. Now, when they looked at career satisfaction for all residents and program satisfaction, thankfully, all the residents were still satisfied in their decision to pursue surgery. However, more of the LGBT residents considered leaving the program and even had this higher risk of suicide. So I think Dr. Worth definitely spun it as a glass half full and things are improving. And I agree with, the Me Too, with Black Lives Matter, with, I'd say, the millennial generation kind of picking up the reins and trying to really create change. I think we are moving in the right direction. However, I think also as attendings, it is definitely easier and safer to be out than the residents. And with that in mind, I surveyed some of my peers. They felt, again, that, being part of this LGBT community is the new norm and treated it as such. Thus, if people are talking about their spouses in the OR, they're going to talk about their same-sex partner and just kind of normalize it, which I think is very good. I can't really comment on one size fits all for disclosing identity. I think it depends on an individual preference, environmental safety, institutional culture. And I do worry about the role of implicit bias in this process and the impact of intersectionality between sexual minorities and people of color. I think the one group that I want to call attention to, a lot of trainees approach me when I talk on this topic and they say, hey, I'm in this community, should I come out on my application for medical school, residency, fellowship? And normally what I tell them is, sure, if you're doing research in this area, please list it. If you are the president of the LGBT club, yes, include it. And what I hear when they're asking me this really is a sense of fear and stress. And when I reflect on this recent 2020 study showing that residents experience a significant amount of discrimination and harassment, I worry that in the programs where they have that experience, are those beliefs and values going to also translate into the interview process? And, you know, for the person where I advise them, hey, if you're the president of the LGBT club, just put it on there. You know, could I potentially be hindering someone from getting a position if someone looks at two equal candidates and says, hey, this person's head of LGBT, this other person, you know, looks just like, not me, but looks like, you know, the norm. Maybe they'll choose the person who looks more normal just based on their own comfort, because we know with implicit bias, we tend to gravitate towards candidates that are more like us. So I think, I do think there's more work to be done in terms of creating a culture where the residents can actually feel safer and out. And it's hard to really answer the question, how to be an out attending, when we see the residents are really suffering, just based on the numbers from the previous study. I'll just comment briefly on my experience. West Virginia didn't have those protections statewide for sexual orientation and gender identity. So I got out the map and I looked, you know, at the county my job is in. I said, hey, are there protections for sexual orientation, gender identity? Thankfully, there were. And so there's been no looking back. But since I've been in this community, I've really learned more about how to be an advocate for the LGBT community in general. I've started a group here that is a community building group for any LGBT faculty, staff, graduate students, because usually there's an LGBT center for a college, but there aren't that many advocacy groups after that. So, you know, we did an axe throwing event. I wanted to show you guys a picture of that, but I thought that would be a little too West Virginia for you. But, you know, this group, we network, we, you know, create community around ourselves and around these issues. I would encourage every surgeon listening to this to absolutely look at your clinic and look at your forms and add these gender identity, pronouns, and sexual orientation onto the form. And to answer your earlier question, Courtney, about how to approach patients, it's really nice to just allow them to self-disclose, because then you don't really have to ask. You can just look and see if they check the box, and you can bring it up with them. It's a little more comfortable if they've disclosed. I've been working specifically around the intersection of sexual minority and gender minority status and obesity, and trying to learn more what disparities exist for this population. I think there's a big challenge when you're doing research looking at minority groups, because frequently the responses you get to your publications are, oh, this is underpowered, the sample size is too small, when a lot of times what you're submitting is the largest sample size that is available. Finally, what Dr. Key mentioned earlier is really working with your institution. So our institution has those issues right now with our medical record of having difficulty for trans patients, putting in the preferred name, putting in the correct gender. And so I am part of a group that is really working towards updating the medical record for our institution, and also training staff around how to work with people in the sexual and gender minority population. But again, I would say my experience, I don't think I can say this is the only way to be an out academic surgeon, but I do think, you know, this town hall is a very wonderful start to start educating people that these disparities do exist, and that the trainees, I do think, need some role models to understand how to navigate through the surgical culture. And as Courtney mentioned, there is a new society that Julie Sosa and Sanziana Roman have started, the Association of Out Surgeons and Allies. I encourage everyone to join. This is the Twitter tag. And our hope is that we can, continue to raise awareness around this issue.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Nova. So Nova and I actually met on the interview trail a long time ago, and it was really cool to have two queer people in the same space for a little bit. It was nice. We got a lot of questions on the chat that I wanted to throw some of them at you, Nova. So we got a lot of questions for people who are junior residents or students about how to best advocate for themselves when they do experience, discrimination or prejudice. Because I think there's a lot of pressure they put on themselves to kind of be like this, soldier for the LGBT community, but that's very tiring and not often practical. Do you have any kind of advice for how how to deal with things when they happen?
Yeah, I think it's really important to tell someone about it, for any, I would say ultimately on a surgical rotation, if you're having a negative experience, whether it's from a resident, anybody in the hospital, the surgeon in charge should hear about it and find a way to address that. So I also think that there's really room for a qualitative study to be done to start understanding and hearing what the experiences of the LGBT trainees are presently. So what they are experiencing, because I think hearing sort of a narrative and understanding exactly what's happening could open many people's eyes who aren't aware of sort of negative or discriminatory practices. And I think that's also the case for trainees of color experiencing mistreatment. I think it needs to be documented and shared with our community so we can better ourselves.
I think that's all a really important point. I think it's really important for trainees and students especially, like you don't have to fight these battles all by yourself, reach out to somebody who can advocate for you, who's going to help you. Because if you're a third year medical student on a clerkship, like you don't need to be taking on, the homophobic orthopedic, chair or whatever. Like, go find somebody who can, really work with you, and don't feel like you need to take on that burden all alone. The other question that someone has put up here is, you mentioned earlier that it's safer to be out as an attending than as a trainee. And I think that's kind of my sense as well. Could you maybe just kind of distill a little bit of why you think that is and why it's still harder to be an out student or trainee than an attending?
Yeah, I think this project says it all. This is data from after the 2019 ABSITE showing that LGBT trainees are still experiencing a large amount of harassment and discrimination. And so I think being in an attending role is a relative position of power compared to being a trainee, where again, you don't want to rock the boat. I think surgical training is stressful as it is, than to add on this a complaint or feeling like you're not being treated well. But this is, I think, the problem is if our trainees are having a negative experience, how can we then expect them to be positive role models when they finish, maybe kind of bitter and angry about the whole thing?
Absolutely. And I think that if we delve into retention into academia, I bet we'll see that there's a big drop off if we could actually have that data.
I think the one other thing I would add that I don't experience, but my wife does, is passing. this idea of, so people see this person who might be a boy, might be a girl, most likely a woman, but in a suit, they kind of assume correctly that I may be part of a non-gender conforming, those people, right? But there's a lot of gay and just trans people who pass as straight. They look straight. And so I think those trainees actually have more discomfort because they'll say, you know, oh, your husband, or they'll make all these assumptions about you as a trainee that is not correct. And then it's uncomfortable because you don't know as a trainee whether you're going to correct the person. Like, oh no, I have a wife, you know?
All right, well, thank you again so much, everybody, for participating. I think we got to almost all of the questions that people posted. Yun just reported that there's some more data that will probably be coming out about this survey from the second trial, because they did get randomized some people got randomized to an intervention arm. So hopefully we'll have some more data that is specific to behaviors that were witnessed. But again, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining. I think this was a wonderful discussion. It's a good start to some work that we really need to continue. And we will be looking to continue to partner with other organizations, and specifically we'll be excited to partner with the Association of Out Surgeons and Allies in the future. Also, I just want everybody to know that the AAS is a safe space. So if there is a concern or question that you wanted to discuss but either didn't get around to it today, or we didn't have time to do it in detail or to address it in detail, send me a private message on Twitter, or send me an email at cnclark@mcw.edu, and we will definitely be able to find a member, an AAS member, or an AOSA member who would be willing to sort of help you navigate some of these issues. And I see that Yun just posted a link to the questionnaire. Bullying, we use the negative acts questionnaire. So if anybody wants to look at what those questions look like, you can go to that article for more details. Thanks again. We went a little bit over, but I think it was really necessary to cover everything. This video will be posted in a few days on the AAS website. So if you didn't get a chance to watch it in completeness, or if you know of somebody who was unable to sign on tonight, please let them know to check back on our website in a couple of days. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.